I don't know about you, but whenever I see something at the store like this, all I want to do is add even more details to it, especially if those details include lights. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you how to do today. My name is Sayer, and this is Witch Cove Crafts. Let's get started. First things first, gotta get it out of the box. Don't forget to save any clear plastic you find in your raccoon pile of salvaged scrap building materials that you'll totally use at some point. Yep. With our tithe paid to the raccoon goddess, now it's time to take a quick look at the set and figure out how to get it apart. And then promptly fail to do so after a lot of straining yields all of 2 plants. At which point you'll remember you're going to cover this whole thing in paint and plaster, and you can break out the clippers. After salvaging the plants for later, a few quick snips and some delicate coaxing is enough to get the gate free of its grassy mount. For the base, a cheap solution comes courtesy of a gessoed panel from the art store. The gesso isn't actually important, except in this case it was on clearance. After checking the fit loosely, some super thin superglue attacks it in place. Now, if we're going to put lights in this, we're going to have to pull it apart. Don't use a knife when you're doing this. It will get you nowhere, and you'll probably just stab yourself. I did not think of this initially. Instead, a cheap plastic spudger, like the kind you get in a $5 electronics repair kit, is great for separating plastic pieces without damaging them. Or yourself. Be sure to get properly distracted by any weird engineering choices in the toy you're taking apart. Like these flames made out of a single strip of flexible green material that's been painted for some reason. With that out of the way, the front of the gate gets glued in place to give something stable to work with, and we can break out the LEDs. In this case, I'm using LEDs with a built-in flame flicker effect to make things easier. They're a little on the larger side from what I usually use, but there should be just enough room here for them to fit in the original housing of the toy. And of course, check all your components first, repeatedly throughout the whole process. Happened to find a dead LED out of the 8 I needed, thankfully, before soldering anything. If you have shaky hands like me, one of these helping hands is pretty much a requirement for soldering, and even then, it's a bit hard on wires like this. So, of course, I picked a project with so many LEDs. With the soldering done, I added heat shrink to the LEDs and glued them all in place on the gate, stripped the wires, and soldered them to a single connection point, then drilled out a hole on the bottom of the base to tuck everything out of the way. With the main lights done, it's time to move on to the terrain. With a quick slice, a couple quick slices of a hobby saw to trim down the plastic of the original toy. Now, thanks to my pile of XPS insulation foam offcuts, we can start to build up some cliffs. To shape the foam, I use a hot wire knife. But make sure you wear a respirator and have plenty of ventilation when doing this indoors. It's not that much different than sketching, building up shapes gradually and refining the texture with the wire knife. You're better off doing it in pieces over time than trying to get one perfect, cohesive shape. I really can't stress enough how useful this foam is. It's normally used for insulation and construction, so it comes in absolutely enormous sheets at the hardware store. I think I bought this sheet for like $35 a year ago, and I still have most of it stacked up in the garage. I had to break it apart to get it in my car. Maybe I need to do some larger projects. With the shapes built up the way we want, I can grab some plaster rocks that I have on hand, molded from a Woodland Scenics rock mold, and glue them into place on the foam. This will give a little more fine, crisp detail to the cliffs, which is especially important to sell a sense of scale on a small piece like this. After cleaning up the desk a bit, now it's time to add a ceiling and texture layer. This is a pretty common diorama builder's mixture of roughly equal parts plaster, acrylic paint, and Mod Podge for sealing, with water to thin it. This both gives me a medium with which to fill gaps and to add texture by adding more plaster, as well as to seal the XPS foam and prevent it from being dissolved by the spray paint primer later. I like to start with a thin layer over the whole thing and then add in more plaster to whatever I have left to dab on some stickier texture and volume wherever I want to build up the terrain a bit. Afterwards, you want to leave it overnight to give it time to dry. With that done, a few layers of sand, rocks, and model train ballast add some extra life to the base, and we can seal it all in place with watered down white glue, also known as PVA glue, and a few drops of isopropyl alcohol to help it spread. And finally, we can add a little raptor friend I harvested from the main toy with clippers, and glue the gate components back together. Somebody has to be opening the door, after all. Now, the original toy came with these chunky plastic fences that don't really do a great job of selling the scale of the electric fences from the movie. So we'll scratch build some better ones out of wire and tubing. I'll start by drilling some holes into the base, both for mounting and to run wires through later. I want to be able to replicate the lights on top of the fence in the end. The main body of the fence posts are made by popping some hollow styrene tubes through the drilled holes, then adding some rings cut from larger tubes to the posts to create collars at the base. Next, I can do the same for the wire mounts, using the existing holes from the plastic fences the model came with. Rather than try to solve the whole problem at once, it's often easier to glue a large piece in place than trim it down once you see exactly what you need. After that, I can mark and drill out matching holes on the posts, enabling me to run lengths of fine wire through the holes I drilled. For both your wire and the styrene, check your local hobby or even just a craft store. They often have bulk packages of materials like this for just a few dollars. Off camera, I ended up adding a couple small pico LEDs to the top of the poles and glued the wire in place. And now we have something much better than the chunky plastic it came with originally. I just have to do it again. I'll spare you from that. Finally, I glue the plants I salvaged from the original down onto a strip of packaging to make them easier to prime and repaint. To save a bit of hassle, I decided to keep the paint job for the sign on top of the gate, and carefully masked off the letters along with all the LEDs. And finally, I mixed up a mixture of plaster and Sculptamold with water to make a thick paste, to make it easy to fill in any remaining gaps in the base before priming. Sculptamold is basically just paper mache, and adding extra plaster gives it a strong, more texturable surface. This is a really quick way not only to even out textures in areas where you connected multiple pieces of foam together, but it also lets you add small mounds of dirt and terrain where you might need it. And once it dries, it sands really nicely, making it possible to make all the sides nice and smooth before I took everything outside to prime. And then I accidentally deleted all the footage of painting the base and attaching the car while I was trying to get the videos off my phone. Lesson learned, use something with a removable memory card. So we'll pick up from the plants. A couple layers of green paints and ink from the airbrush, followed by some hand-painted details, leaves them looking much nicer than when we started. And with my magically painted and flocked base ready to go, I can glue the plants in place. Oh, small note, don't place your tripod next to your air compressor on the floor. Or do, I don't know, maybe it's a look you're going for. A few more layers of branches and debris locked in place with super thin superglue, and a little more highlighting on the door rounds it off. And let's not forget our little friend. Whenever you're building a diorama, always look for an opportunity to add just a little bit of story to it. Finally, we're ready to finish the electronics. We solder all the connections together. Be sure to color code your positive and negative terminal wires on your LEDs. They only work in one direction. Heat shrinking everything, and finally, my favorite trick, adding these tiny potentiometers to act as dimmer switches for the LEDs. This way I can tune the relative brightness of each element. The car, the headlights, the flames, and the fence lights precisely. The potentiometer is just an adjustable resistor, which pulls off some extra voltage from the LEDs. Since all the LEDs were wired in parallel and have the exact same voltage requirement as my battery source, that means that any amount you turn the potentiometer will reduce the brightness of that particular element. Finally, we add a little switch in the back to cap it all off. For the final touch, we want to replace the flames from the original using UV resin and alcohol inks, so the lights can show through. A brighter black light than the one I used for my nails would probably have been a good idea, but oh well. Translation, don't buy one of these nail UV lights for resin work. They're only like $5, but the actual resin lights are only like $12, so. I learned after this and got one of the resin lights. Initially, I tried to build up the flames in 3D, which didn't really work, probably in part due to how weak my light was. So instead, I drew out flame shapes with resin on a piece of wax paper, then cured and secured those in place and used them to build up the flame shapes in 3D. After one last test, it was time to solder the switch in and paint the base with Musso Black. If you've never used it before, Musso Black is an incredibly dark, hyper matte black paint that absorbs something like 99.8% of light when applied correctly. It gives the base this very cool void effect, even in person, that really helps draw the focus to the diorama. And with all that, it's ready. All in all, this gave an incredible result for really not that much. I think the toy cost me like $15, and I used maybe $6 or $7 worth of materials for the whole thing. But the result looks incredible. Hopefully this inspires you to try something similar with the next fun little toy you see when you're out shopping. Share in the comments. I'd love to see what you do. Thanks for watching. I'm Sayer, and I'll see you next time here on Witch Cove Crafts.